Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this sunny evening for our special In Conversation event. I'm Tom Stammers, I'm reader in art and cultural history here at the Courtauld, and this talk is being organised in association with the new MA in Art and Business that I am leading with Stephanie Dikos, who is also here in the room. Now, as we explore the relationship between art and business, the visual representation of art dealers is a fascinating topic. And there is perhaps no more famous example in Britain than John Singer Sargent's portrait of Asher Wertheimer from 1901, a picture which has generated so many different and divergent critical readings. Sargent went on to produce a dozen portraits of the Wertheimer family, which have always been greatly admired as a series, and which were exhibited together at the Jewish Museum in New York in 1999, and then again were given their own special room at Tate Britain in 2022. And neither the character of the sitters nor the full story of the artist's relationship, indeed his collaboration with the Wertheimer family, has been told until the publication of the book that we are here to celebrate tonight, Jean Strous's wonderful family romance. And we're very grateful that Jean is just in the UK for a week, and she's already done one of these events in a different format somewhere else, and we're so lucky at the Courtauld that she's joining us today. Jean is one of the foremost biographers working today, and her previous publications indicate why she is the perfect chronicler of this topic. Her study of Alice James, the once overlooked sister of William and Henry, won the Bancroft Prize in American history, and has actually been reprinted as a classic in that New York Review of Books series, with a wonderful preface by Comte Bean. Meanwhile, her biography of J.P. Morgan is an indispensable guide to the link between collecting and finance in the Gilded Age. Jean is also an accomplished and acclaimed essayist and reviewer, and the same could be said for her interlocutor tonight, James Macaulay, who was the former Paris correspondent at the Washington Post. Some of you will know, and I'm glad I have my prop, James is the author of this wonderful book, The House of Fragile Things, which is a deeply moving study of Jewish collectors in 20th century France, and which won the National Jewish Book Award. They are both superb writers and sensitive cultural historians, and I am so grateful to them both for being here to explore some of the themes in Jean's remarkable book. So they will be in conversation now before opening up to questions from the audience. Afterwards, I hope you will join us to continue discussion next door with a glass of wine, and there will also be a chance to purchase Jean's book. But now let me hand over to James to start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the exceedingly generous introduction. And in fact, when Jean and I were brainstorming our conversation for today, we both agreed that absolutely neither of our books could have been written without your wonderful scholarship in the area. So it is an honor to be here tonight with all of you, and thank you for joining us on this very beautiful summer night when you might very well be outside somewhere else. Lovely to be here all together. And yes, to celebrate a truly brilliant new book, which of course is for sale after the fact. I will not let us leave until all of those are gone. And again, I'm going to do the conversation tonight in a way that does not assume that anybody has read it, sort of to get into the heart of the matter in a way that it's accessible for all. So Jean, it is a true pleasure to be with you. Your scholarship, in particular your writing, has been an inspiration to so many of us. And like Tom was saying, you've written so movingly about Alice James, about the Morgans, and now about Sargent and the Wertheimers. And to begin, I was wondering if you could tell us how you chose this particular topic, how it spoke to you, and what the research odyssey was like on this particular project, which has taken you several years to put together.
It has indeed. Thank you very much. And Tom, thank you for that lovely introduction and for having us do this. I'm very pleased to be here. So I happened to see the exhibition that Tom mentioned that was organized by the Jewish Museum in New York. It showed in New York in 1999. I live in New York, but I did not see it there. I was doing some work in Seattle a couple of years later, and there was a show of work by Sargent, and I had gotten to know Sargent slightly through my books on the Jameses and Morgans. He has sort of walk-on roles in those two books, but I didn't really know much about him. And so I went to see this show because of Sargent and discovered that, in fact, it was a show of the Wertheimer, his paintings, 12 portraits of the Wertheimer family, about whom I knew absolutely nothing. And I learned from the wall text and the labels on the paintings and descriptions of photographs and objects that the father of the family was Asher Wertheimer, of German Jewish descent, an eminent art dealer in London who had 10 children. And he had commissioned Sargent to do himself and his wife for their 25th wedding anniversary in 1897. And they, in that process, got to be good friends. And then he was commissioned to go on and paint all 10 of the Wertheimer children, singly and in groups. It was the largest commission Sargent ever had, which made Asher his greatest private patron. He worked on them between 1897 and 1908, and Mach complained to a friend during that time of being in a state of chronic Wertheimerism. Asher, for his part, thought it was too bad there were not more Wertheimers for Sargent to paint. So I was very intrigued by these people, by this story. It was clear from the photographs and the labels that they had become quite good friends. I thought of Sargent, as I think most of us do, as painting European aristocrats and American wealthy Boston Brahmins and New York society people. Did not think of him as painting Jews. And I wanted to know more about this. And I was not looking to write another book just then. My Morgan book had come out in 1999. But I wondered how they'd gotten to know each other, whether Sargent had painted other Jewish subjects, what was the nature of their friendship, had he gotten close to the children as well as the adults, and what was the story here? So I went back to New York, I bought the catalog, I kept wondering about it, and I learned that there was not much actual documentation for the Wertheimers, which was discouraging. So I would sort of get close to doing something about this and then give up because I wasn't much, and then I come back to it. So over about 10 years, I crept towards doing more, and I got in touch with a descendant. There was a, I hope this isn't going on for too long.
This is what we're
Someone had put together a John Singer Sargent virtual gallery online, and someone had written in asking about one of the Wertheimer portraits, and one of the descendants had responded saying he didn't know much more about this portrait, but that he'd be happy to correspond about it, and he gave his email address. So I wrote to him, and then I called him, and then I went to England to see him. His name was Julian Matthias, and he introduced me to many other members of the family, including his aunt, Catherine Matthias, who 4 or 5 of her 5 children are here tonight. So this is really lovely to see you all and celebrate her. She was in her 90s when I met her. She had an incredible memory. She had papers, photographs, other documents, and I went to see her as often as I could. She was just invaluable. I could not have done this project without her. The records of the Wertheimer art dealing firm had been destroyed, alas, so I didn't have that. It was sort of patchy what there was, but with her help, I did manage to reconstruct some of the story of these people. And then Sargent, there's a lot of information about Sargent because he's so famous. He wrote a number of letters to friends, which were scattered all over the world, according to where the recipients had left them with libraries or in their family collections. His handwriting is almost impossible to read. I have an example here in the slides, and I'll show it to you. But there was much more documentation about Sargent, and so I thought that wouldn't be as hard as the Wertheimer part. So that's sort of how I got into it, and what the research challenges we can get into some more later.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by the aha moments that captivate writers to embark on these experiences. But that's fascinating. I think that's a wonderful pivot into the nature of the book. So I thought next we might talk, or you might introduce a little bit the Wertheimer family, the wonderful characters that you have drawn so well in the books, maybe starting with Asher and Samson Wertheimer and the arrival of this German Jewish family in England, and then a little bit more about Sargent and how the painter met the subject.
Okay. That's Sargent, we'll come back to him. And that's Asher by Sargent. Asher's father, Samson Wertheimer, who was descended from another Samson Wertheimer who was in Vienna at the turn of the 18th century. He was what was called a court factor or court Jew, meaning financier. There were no banking systems at that time. And so when powerful rulers needed to raise money, they depended on these financiers who had good networks and were able to raise money for wars and treaties and so on. So that Samson Wertheimer, the early one, was at that time the wealthiest Jew in Vienna, in the Habsburg lands, and had houses all over Austria and Germany, had many children, and was called the Judenkaiser, the Jewish emperor. And he had many children, and down that line, eventually in the 19th century, was another Samson Wertheimer who was born in Fürth in Bavaria. And Fürth was not, none of the Bavarian Catholic states were very good to Jews. They were better after Napoleon, but not great. And he left, as many of the Jews at that time did, and he went to London. He was a bronze maker, a very, very skilled craftsman in bronze and ormolu, which is gilded bronze. He went to London, I think probably with very, very little means, settled in the East End, and quickly he was making bronze, and somehow, we don't really know how, he knew a great deal, or learned a great deal, about the great artisans of 18th century France who worked in bronze and ormolu. And that was what the 19th century art markets wanted, especially the British art markets. They wanted these beautiful French decorative arts and portraits. He could copy the works of these great artisans and craftsmen, and eventually, it did not take very long, he moved into actually buying the originals and selling them. So he became very quickly, he arrived in 1839, by 1854 he was became a British citizen, and he had a royal warrant, which is for people who are selling things to the royal family. And among his first clients were Rothschilds. Those would be the clients you would want. And the Wertheimer family kept selling to the Rothschilds for the next 5 decades. That they remained very, very primary dealers to the Rothschilds. So Samson had 2 sons. His wife also came from Fürth, from Bavaria, and the sons were Asher and Charles, and they both also went into the art dealing business. Samson did so well, he left about 365,000 pounds when he died in 1892, which I think would be about 60 million pounds today. So for 1892, that was really successful. Both of his sons did even better, and they were dealing in what the art markets at that time wanted, which we can talk more about, but it was a lot of 18th century French decorative arts, as I mentioned, and old master paintings, and the sort of social, political drama here in this period is that the British aristocracy at that time was rapidly losing altitude, losing status, power, and certainly income. And the rising new people in America and England and Europe very much wanted to acquire the trappings of the older aristocracy. So the lords and dukes did not want to sell their great houses or their land, they might sell their daughters to a wealthy American. There's actually a new show that's just opening today at Kenwood House about Sargent's paintings of, it's called Heiresses. It's the rich American girls who came to England and married into the aristocracy, bringing their means, such as Consuelo Vanderbilt, who married the 9th Duke of Marlborough. But they could sell art because it was mobile, it was increasingly valuable as land became decreasingly valuable. And it really is the birth of the modern art market as we know it today. And the Wertheimers, smart dealers, put themselves right at that point between the old families who wanted to sell, usually privately and quietly, and the new, what Bernard Berenson called the Americans, the new squillionaires who absolutely wanted what these old families had and were selling.
Before we get into more on the art market and the moment in the late 19th century in general, one of the things that I found so captivating about your book, and I'm sure all readers of it will find, is that it is a wonderful book about art. It is a wonderful book about the Jews, about a very particular and distinguished family. But it is profoundly a book about Britain. And I was just going to read a few lines from it. And you write so meaningly: the question, who is England, runs through channels of turbulent history between the 1880s and the 1920s. Was it the old aristocracy, many of its members in financial and political decline but still assuming sovereign privilege, newly wealthy plutocrats acquiring Oxbridge education, seats in parliament, grand houses, land, titles, and art, writers and intellectuals who claimed the moral high ground, the people who did the country's physical labor, farmers, bricklayers, factory workers, coal miners, the young men who went off to fight and often died for Britain in the Great War. And what is so captivating to me about the story that you tell is that you have that it is a story about Britain written by outsiders in pretty much every way. So you have Sargent, the American painter, come to London to depict the faces of the new British aristocracy, who, as you say, are these emigres from, in the Wertheimers' case, from Germany, Jews who have become very successful in London. And it's a period of that kind of transition. So I wonder, if you could say a little bit more about the relationship of painter and subjects to conceptions of Englishness in that very fraught and turbulent time, as you mentioned.
Absolutely, good question, thank you. Sargent was definitely painting the new plutocrats, but he was also painting the old line aristocracy. Everybody in this drama wanted to be painted by him. One of the surprising things is that he was the leading portrait artist of transatlantic society by 1900. The first Wertheimer portraits were done in 1897-98, as I said. And he did a portrait of Lady Sassoon, who had been born a Rothschild, a French Rothschild, Aline de Rothschild. It was shown at the Royal Academy in 1907, and someone who knew Sargent said and wrote down that he said, Sargent paints nothing but Jews and Jewesses now, and says he prefers them as they have so much more life and movement than our English women. So it was really surprising to the standard British culture that this leading figure who could have painted everybody wanted to be painted by Sargent, that he would choose to do so many Jews. And he did a great many aristocratic British sisters, most of them seated in a middle distance, usually 3 of them. They're absolutely gorgeous paintings, and not to take anything away from them at all. But more life and movement is what you see in this picture of the Wertheimer girls. They're close to the picture plane. They're about to step out into the room, into their lives, into our lives. There's so much vitality there. He was always, and we'll come back to this in a minute, looking for visual drama, and he absolutely found it in exotic places of the world, and he found it in Paris and in London, he definitely found it in Jews. And among his other Jewish subjects, I'm going off from what you actually asked,
this is
but
wonderful.
he was very close to the Sassoons, Lady Sassoon, whom I mentioned, and her children, Sybil and Philip, and the family of Karl Mayr, Mrs. Karl Mayr and her children, George Lewis, who was one of the leading solicitors of the time. He did about a total of about 1,300 portraits in both oil and in charcoal. We can talk about that later. He sort of swore off doing oil portraits in 1907. Of that total, about 70 are Jewish subjects, which isn't really that many, about 5%, but it's a little more than that because a little less than that actually, because he did several of them more than once. He didn't do many people more than once, but he did several of his Jewish friends. And they were really close friends. That I think he was very drawn to them. We can talk a little bit about why. I'll go down that rabbit hole now for a minute. He was especially close to the taller girl in this picture, Ina, short for Helena. When he was working on this portrait, this is in 1901, and they're posed in their family's drawing room. Asher was a dealer, as we've said, in very fine art, and the house was full of it. You can see their picture frames behind the girls, and and Ina's hand is on the lid of a tall Chinese vase. Her sister Betty has her turned. It really shows Sargent's virtuosity. He was showing off a bit here to do that long arm extended by the open fan, and some medical student was. People were saying there's no arm is that long. That's not really possible. And he photographed 20 arms and proved that this was anatomically correct. But Ina was really Sargent's favorite. And when he was working on this painting in his studio, an American visitor came and he said, "What do you think of the taller girl?" And then his own questions went on to say what he thought. He said, "Isn't Miss Wertheimer handsome?" And then again, "Isn't she beautiful?" And she was 6 feet tall, full of vitality, masses of dark hair, and they remained such close friends for many decades that her husband wondered whether they'd had an affair. And this is going to fast forward a lot. When she died in the 1930s, her husband found a packet of letters from Sargent to her. He couldn't read them because Sargent's handwriting was so impossible. He gave them to their daughter, who couldn't read them either. And he asked the daughter, he said, "Do you think Mummy had an affair with Sargent?" And she took them to her Aunt Betty, who's the other daughter in that picture, and Betty couldn't read them. But as to whether or not Sargent and Ina had an affair, Betty said, "Oh, don't be silly, darling. Everyone knew he was only interested in Venetian gondoliers." That story is repeated twice. There's another version of it in which it's Mrs. Wertheimer who says it when people ask if she's not worried about her daughter spending so much time with Sargent. Whether or not that's true about gondoliers, and I don't think it is. I mean, certainly Sargent's inclinations were gay, but there's no recorded relationship. We don't know of his actually having acted on any of that. They're gorgeous drawings and paintings of nude men, almost none of nude women, although that was the standard subject for art forever. But if the Wertheimer's attitude was, oh, everyone knew he was interested in gondoliers, if that was their tolerant attitude, I think it also helps explain his comfort with them. And they were both outsiders in different ways. I mean, Jews, no matter how wealthy, were never going to be one of us in aristocratic British society. And Sargent, although he was welcomed in the drawing rooms and given commissions by all of these grand families, he was American. He never gave up his American citizenship. So they were both nomad. They were all nomads in certain ways.
Before we return to maybe some questions about the art market and the figure of the dealer, just on the question of relationship between painter and subject when it comes to portraiture, and it's I'm very interested in whether we can say that that Sargent's portraits of the Wertheimers constitute sort of Jewish portraits, so to speak, and what we mean when we say that. And in my own work, this is something that I thought a lot about vis-a-vis Renoir and his Jewish sitters in Third Republic France, and I wonder, you sort of started to talk about this in your remarks just a minute ago. But I mean, how do you address that question? How do you think about it? When we look at the paintings, are we seeing? Well, we are obviously seeing the portrait of a family, but are we seeing a slightly different approach than Sargent would have taken with other sitters? I mean, how to think about the Jewishness of the sitters in the visual realm?
Absolutely, good question. I'll get to that in a minute. But how did you think about it, about the Renoirs?
I think, having read your book, I think I drew the same conclusion that you did, which is that the art isn't necessarily Jewish in any distinct way, but it is the context in which the art was produced that is the differentiating factor. And of course with Renoir it's very different because he harbored very strongly anti-Semitic attitudes and had a lot of very nasty things to say about some of his sitters. So that changed the dynamic a little bit. But I mean, like it seems with Sargent, I mean, Renoir's portraits of some of his Jewish subjects are the most, in my mind, some of the most beautiful and kind of captivating images in his of. So it's tricky.
It is tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah. This portrait of Asher has been a Rorschach test for 100 years. When it was first shown at the Royal Academy in 1898, it got a great deal of praise. Happy is the man who was painted thus, said one of the critics. It was compared to a Rembrandt. Rembrandt painted a lot of Jews. But it was also, even then, came in for a lot of criticism. An American, not just British, there was an American who was also sitting for Sargent at the same time, who saw this in progress at the studio and said, Asher has one hand, his thumb is hooked into his right thumb is hooked into his pocket, and the left hand is holding a cigar. And this man, Ian Phelps Stokes, said he looks as if he's pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. And the Asher made a gift of this portrait of 8 of the portraits to, actually 9. 9 of the portraits were given to the National Gallery in his will. So he and his wife kept them during their lifetimes, and then after they had both died, they were transferred to the National Gallery. And there was debate about them in Parliament, and one of the MPs who was from Oxford, who was a professor at Oxford, said to the head of the committee, can't you manage it so that we don't have to have these repulsive pictures on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner? So there you have it. I mean, he's absolutely, Sargent is not minimizing Asher's Jewishness in this painting. His red, wet lips, his eyes could be read as amused and glimmering with humor or as shrewd and calculating, and they have been read both ways. He has his poodle the noble was in the lower right-hand corner of this painting. His tongue is hanging out, sort of could be a slavering Jewish trope or anti-Semitic trope. It's a very powerful painting, and it has elicited very powerful responses all along the way. I think, after having lived with these subjects and these paintings for a long time, I think that Asher, some of his friends were offended. They thought it was an anti-Semitic painting. Asher was not only not offended, but he commissioned Sargent to go on and do 10 more family portraits. I believe very much, and this is also about the larger social setting and market, I think he wanted his family to be presented to the National Gallery among the aristocrats. Portraits have always been the province of wealthy people. Royals popes, kings.
The ultimate self-presentation.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that's, Holbein paints the court of Henry VIII. Sargent painted the court of Asher Wertheimer. And so for Asher to give these to the National Gallery was very controversial, but I think he wanted his family and his religion represented there, along with everything else that was represented in the National Gallery. And I think he was fine with how he looked. This is who I am. He was not devoutly religious, but he never rejected his Jewishness. His children, some of them did. Two of the sons changed their names. Most of them who did not marry Jews, although some did. But I think Asher just sort of thought, this is who I am.
Yeah. And as you write in the book, you say, or toward the end, you say, what made these paintings controversial in the past is, in addition to their aesthetic merits, what gives them fresh force and consequence now. So in a way, everything that made certain of their consumer, or their viewers squeamish is now why we care about them, in a sense. Like, it's a window into this moment in time when everything was changing, and when, as you say, like, kind of newer, not aristocrats, but newer plutocrats had an entry into this kind of rarefied world that they didn't have access to even a generation before. And the portraits are the kind of material manifestation of that change, so to speak.
Sort of speaking a claim.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, on that note, that's a good segue back into the a little bit more on the moment that we are in, sort of 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century, fin de siècle here in London. And London, of course, a capital of a new and very robust art market with a number of prominent Jewish dealers and collectors active in it. And, again, I'm somewhat embarrassed to be sitting up here yammering on about this when Tom, who is such an expert on this subject, is in the audience. But it's an incredibly rich moment in time, and as you were saying, a time when one could acquire the trappings of the Ancien Regime as a means of simulating belonging in whatever sort of imagined annals of aristocracy were available. And this was the motive for many collectors, both Jewish and not Jewish, in the time. And of course, Asher Wertheimer is in the middle of this world. So I wonder how you would situate him in the context of that market and in those dealers, and in and also how you I mean, I think different scholars see it differently, but how you would situate him in the context of what that moment meant for Jews, with the ability to aspire to social acceptance, hitherto unforeseen.
We should also perhaps talk about some of your collectors from. Everyone should read The House of Fragile Things, which is a really extraordinarily wonderful book. And these collectors were buying Ancien Regime trappings and glorious works of art, and just sort of defining themselves for themselves and the world as French, as the heirs to this great tradition. And they thought of themselves that way until Hitler and Vichy didn't, which is an incredibly dramatic and powerful story. So,
well, it's very much like what you were saying with Asher Wertheimer making this bequest to the National Gallery. It's the same motive of seeing oneself as a custodian of a national heritage that one might have adopted, or that one's forebears might have adopted, but that one absolutely had a claim to. It's that same motive, and that in some way, in the case of Fragile Things, they really felt themselves to be more French than the French. And I wonder if you would say the same for the Wertheimers in this way.
That they felt themselves to be more English than
in a way.
In some ways. There's a wonderful line in a book about the Sybil and Philip Sassoon by the historian Peter Stansky, who describes Philip Sassoon as an Englishman of the Jewish persuasion, no matter how comparatively unpersuaded he might have been. Which, that's all you need to say in some ways. So, yes, I think another thing that comes out of this, which we might want to talk about as well, and Tom has written about this too, many Jews gave their art to public museums, and some of the Rothschilds in France did, but the English ones did not really. I mean, Ferdinand Rothschild kept most of his art at Waddesdon. He gave one spectacular bequest to the British Museum. But so what determines who gives, and the old aristocratic families didn't give it to the National Gallery. They kept it, they passed it along to their sons and daughters, and when they needed money, they sold it to rich Americans, which caused a great national outcry, and out of that came a national art fund that tried to preserve many of these works for England. So that's, sorry, going off on a tangent, but what is it about Jewish collectors who feel Ludwig Mond gave a fantastic collection to the National Gallery? He comes into the Wertheimer story too. So what is that motive? Now I've lost my thread. Oh, I was actually going to say one other thing about Sargent. The Dreyfus affair comes up very much in your story, and it comes up here rather indirectly. Sargent was asked to show paintings at the 1900 Exhibition Universelle, and the paintings that he chose in 1900 at the height of the Dreyfus affair, or one of the heights of the Dreyfus affair, were Asher Wertheimer and Mrs. Karl Meyer and her children, also of Jewish family, and the president of Bryn Mawr College, an American lesbian. But so for him to choose two Jews in the middle of the Dreyfus affair, he doesn't say anything about that. He was not a political creature, but I think that probably says quite a lot. So we're talking, now I've lost the thread again, about Jewishness and art dealing in that moment.
In that moment, I mean, I think it's such a rich topic that many people have written on, and we'll talk about that new field in a minute. But, you know, I think for me, one of the questions that I'm not sure I ever could decide what I thought about it, but, you know, why we, like, how to articulate it, why we differentiate Jewish collectors and dealers in this moment from their non-Jewish counterparts when, you know, every plutocratic upstart, Jewish, not Jewish, whatever, was really drawn to the same things, more or less, because it made a statement, right? And I think in the French case, the answer for why looking at Jewish collectors and dealers specifically is because, you know, eventually, as you said, the authorities told them that they were not French and they suffered accordingly. In the British case, it's slightly different. And I wonder, you know, what you make of that. I mean, because, of course, Asher Wertheimer is, I mean, I guess another way of looking at it is, to what extent is the relationship between Jews and aesthetics distinct in the late 19th century, and to what extent is it just part of consumer culture and of a new burgeoning consumer culture in that moment?
Good question. Certainly, it has to do very much with wealth and with relatively new wealth and wanting to acquire the trappings of old wealth. And was there something specifically Jewish about it? I mean, certainly J.P. Morgan and Henry Clay Frick were acquiring the same things that the Rothschilds were acquiring.
And for much the same reason.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a story by Henry James called The Outcry that was based on a real thing when one of the, a Holbein painting was almost sold to Frick and rescued at the last minute. And that's where that question about who is England comes from. And there's a Morgan-like character, and they're talking about selling ancestral portraits, and he said, the Morgan-like character says, well, where do the ancestors all come from, if not from the marketplace? In other words, they're buying other people's ancestors. That's what they're acquiring, and along with all the trappings that go along with that. The Goncourt brothers, whom you quote to great effect, talked about Jewish taste.
Mhm.
But as we're saying, it wasn't. It was sort of nouveau riche taste.
Right,
Or-
and in their case, it was also their own taste,
Yes.
more or less.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
so why did it get to be called Jewish? Because they didn't like it, that the Jews were buying up their
well,
cultural heritage.
yeah, exactly. There was a feeling that the Jews were purchasing the items that somehow belonged to other people.
Right.
But that, the items, the value and the pedigree and the desirability of the items was never in question.
Right.
That was sort of universally agreed upon, that these were items that carried some sense of the nation in them, that were
Mhm.
sort of metaphors for a glorious past, and then the purchasing of them became the battleground for the soul of a nation in a way.
Yes,
And
very much.
that was always very interesting to me. But I wonder, would you say that the British case was the same as it was in places like France or in continental Europe?
I think it's a little bit different in that what we're talking about in France is often sort of ancien regime decorative
Of
arts,
course.
which really are French. The
Whereas
British,
here,
what?
Whereas here it's different, right?
Yeah, I mean, the British began, sort of after the Napoleonic Wars, the British began buying up what other European aristocrats were selling.
Mhm.
So, I mean, yes, there's Gainsborough and Reynolds and Lawrence, but they were acquiring Rembrandts and gorgeous decorative art furniture. So it was, and the Elgin marbles, So they were, again, in this Henry James story, somebody said, when we're talking about what's English and what the art belongs to, one of the people says, well, we actually took it away from someone else ourselves. We didn't grow it all. So art moves. It follows culture. It follows material success. And America didn't grow most of what the American collectors bought. It was
Right.
all imported from various European capitals. So what the heritage of these great artists and art is always sort of up for question.
And in that moment, the late 19th century, you mentioned the Dreyfus Affair, but we are in London, not Paris. I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit on the question of anti-Semitism that the Wertheimer family encountered, and what that was like, the sort of social anti-Semitism that they endured, and the kind of annals of London society at the time, and what kind of impact that had on their private lives and also on their relationship to their art and their desire to be depicted in this manner by one of the great portraitists of their time.
Yeah. Good question. Partly because of the very thin Wertheimer archive, I don't actually know a lot of what they experienced in terms of direct anti-Semitism. Certainly they were all very aware of it. Asher and his brother went to the University College schools, which had been started by the University of London. The public schools were, you pretty much had to be Anglican, and so Catholics, Jews, dissidents of all kinds were not allowed to go to those schools. So the University College schools was founded partly to take in all those other people, and they were very good and extremely, a very high number of extremely important people came through those schools. But by the time Asher's children were ready for school, he sent them to Harrow. And then they went to Oxford and Cambridge. And Harrow was no fun at all for a Jewish boy. They only began admitting Jews in the, I think, 1870s and 80s because they needed the money, and that was a good source of money. And they lived in separate housing at first, and then sometimes went into the regular housing, but only the fourth, the youngest of the Wertheimer boys, went on into regular housing. The first three stayed in that sort of Jewish housing. Supposedly at the beginning it was for dietary reasons, which I don't think would have mattered to the Wertheimers, but that was justification for it. They were called junipers, and Charles Rothschild, who was there at the same time, wrote later that if he ever had a son, if he sent him to Harrow, he would train him in jujitsu and other forms of self-defense because they were subjected to so much torment by the regular boys. And when Philip Sassoon went to, I believe it was Oxford, he was chased around the quad by someone with a bullwhip.
You have that in the book.
I do, yeah. I can't remember who it was who was chasing him, but he was shouting with a French accent, because Philip grew up in Paris and he had a French accent. He was chasing with a bullwhip saying, Philippe, Philippe, I see you. This was horrible. So it had to be extremely painful for all of them.
And just as we move forward in time a little bit, I wonder if you might be able to walk us through sort of what happens to, just in brief, the Wertheimer family as we get through World War I and the 20s and the 30s. So the many children of Asher Wertheimer, like what becomes of them? You mentioned some of them marry Jews, some of them don't. Just for our audience tonight, sort of how does the family romance, so to speak, continue, and how does it end?
Well, for some it ends rather unhappily, and Ina was the principal romance, and I think Asher and Sargent were very, very close. The two eldest sons, this is the Wertheimer country house in Berkshire. On the left is someone who's not, we don't really know who he is. Then Asher, then a painter named Antonio Mancini, who Sargent had introduced to the Wertheimers. Wasn't a very good painter, but Sargent was very, very kind to him. Then Sargent, by far the tallest, and Edward, the oldest Wertheimer son. There's Asher, so we see how Sargent portrayed him, and we see how he looked on his own. Not exactly the same, but definitely the same person. Mrs. Wertheimer, apparently, she was done the same time as Asher, and they didn't like this painting. She told some of her descendants have said that she thought it made her look too rich. She's wearing lace and many, many jewels, and she does look rich. But did she choose those? Sargent was very involved in choosing what his subjects wore. That you may have seen a wonderful show at the Tate called Sargent and Fashion a couple of years ago, and they had some of the dresses in the show, and he was very much curating what his subjects wore. So was this his idea or her idea? But it was not in the gift that Asher gave to the National Gallery. He did her again 4 years later, and by this time, her two eldest sons had died, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think you see that in this painting, which is, it's completely different. She's still wearing jewels, but they're much quieter, in black instead of white. And she's very grave and sort of majestic and apart. It's a very, very quiet picture with grief. And it actually matches the Asher portrait a little better because of the dark tones. And Asher hung all eight principal portraits in the family dining room at Connaught Place, where they lived. And the Sargent was such a frequent guest for dinner that it came to be known as Sargent's Mess. He loved good food, and they had excellent French cooks. Even Monet, who came to dinner one night, said that the food was great. These are some of the younger children. I'll go by them quickly. So that's the eldest son, Edward, who died. This is unfinished, this painting. It was done in 1902, and in early 1903 he went to Paris on his honeymoon and died from eating a bad oyster, which tells you they were not kosher. Which was tragic. He was the only one who went into the family art dealing business with his father, and so that was the end of the Wertheimer name in the art trade. And the second son, Alfred, who was very beautiful and was a chemist, and you can see the glass flasks on the wall behind him representing his chemistry trade. He went to work for a chemical company after he didn't even finish at Oxford, but he wanted to be an actor, which his father absolutely would not hear of. They fought bitterly over it. Sargent tried to mediate between them, and there's some wonderful letters from Sargent to Alfred, sort of saying, come have lunch with me tomorrow. I have talked to your father yesterday. He really means it. He's going to cut you out of his will, and I would hate to see you have a life of difficulty and stringency, so let's talk about this. And then there's a second letter like that. And a couple of months after this painting was shown in London, it made Alfred a star. He couldn't walk around Mayfair without being recognized. So he went to South Africa with a friend whom he'd been to South Africa before, and he died in his hotel room from an overdose of morphine to which he had been addicted. And as a chemist, he would have had access to that. So these two boys died in their 20s, the two oldest Wertheimer sons. The next two are interesting, but not as interesting. And wait, that's a Sargent letter. Yeah, I will get back to that in a minute. So this is. Do you want to do the other portrait of Ina?
Sure.
Okay. So the Ina, it gets into the social story a bit. Ina, Sargent painted her again. As I said, they were very close. She came into his studio for this portrait in 1904 with her, she was late, and her cloak and scarf were flying out behind her, as she was always late. And he loved seeing that and decided he would paint her just like that, in full sail, which he called a vela gonfie in Italian. And the Duke of Marlborough, he was painting the Marlborough family at the same time at Blenheim Palace. And the Duke was, for that painting, wearing the robe and hat of the Royal Order of the Garter, which is the most senior order of chivalry in British society. And so he left, he was coming to Sargent's studio for follow-up sittings, and he would leave the robe and hat in the studio, and Sargent and Ina appropriated those props for a very transgressive portrait. I don't know whether that's the actual robe or something very close to it, but I suspect it is the real thing. And having posed before in a very low-cut gown and looking very young and sexy, here she is also looking sexy, but laughing, and in this royal outfit. I mean, she was neither male nor Anglican nor royal, but she's wearing the Royal Order of the Garter, and that she makes the ostrich feathers look sexy. There was a cartoon in Punch at the time this was shown showing this, saying, "Call yourself a soldier, look at me." Sargent was playing around with these subjects a lot, and obviously he felt free enough to do so, which was part of his relationship with them. There's on the far left, right side of the picture, you can see a broom handle that he had Ina hold to poof out the cloak so that it sort of kept the volume that he liked when he saw her come into his studio. Here are the Marlboroughs at Blenheim Palace looking, it's not a very good reproduction, I'm sorry, but there's Consuelo, who was taller. Consuelo Vanderbilt was very rich. She married the 9th Duke of Marlborough, who was very poor by then. Her mother arranged the marriage, forced her to marry him, and she hated it. She was really unhappy, and it didn't last. It lasted about 10 years. They separated shortly after this painting by Sargent. It was done in the Great Hall of Blenheim Palace, and they look so stiff and uncomfortable. The one faintly smiling son and the Blenheim Spaniels give it a little bit of life and vitality, but Consuelo and the Duke do not look very alive at all. They sort of look like the architectural stone. And next to Ina, there you have it again. Both of these portraits were shown at the Royal Academy in 1905. If anyone noticed that the Duke and Ina were wearing the same robe, they did not.
Okay, so my last question before we open it up to the floor. is just to take a step back a little bit and to think about this sort of new genre that has emerged, which is broadly conceived the investigation of Jews and art. And, of course, one thinks of Edmund de Val's wonderful books, The Hair with Amber Eyes and Letters to Camondo. Very recently, there was the truly wonderful Jewish Country Houses project. And I see Juliet in the audience, one of the conveners of that, and also Tom. Your book, and then many others.
And your book.
And many others. And I wonder, what do you think? I mean, there's obviously clear public interest in this, and it really seems to touch on any number of things. What questions do you think that this genre is answering, or that this line of questioning touches on for people? And what seems to resonate? Like, what is it about it that seems to captivate the public so much in this moment in time?
I actually would throw that back to you. I don't know that I really have an answer, or to Tom. I mean, certainly it's a very strong current in our culture right now, even after October 7th, which I've been expecting to get a question about what I think about genocide in Gaza. So far, I have not gotten a question like that, but we are looking at things that we haven't looked at before. And the thing that I said about what made them these paintings unpopular at the turn of the century are precisely what makes them interesting to us now, because these were not the mainstream people and not the mainstream portraits, but we're looking at others in a way that we in many dimensions. One of the things that struck me in doing the research, which I had not known anything about, was that Jews were viewed as Oriental from the East. I had never heard that.
That word comes up all the time in your book.
It does.
Fascinating.
The reviews of these paintings, these Oriental people with their wealth and trappings, and did you know that before you did your book?
A little bit. I mean, in the French case, it's not. I mean, you hear it a little bit, but not to the degree that it manifests in yours.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. I mean, I wonder. I mean, part of it to me is that there's a lot of. Well, there's two things. One is that I think when we look at the subjects, you see people that if we talked about this the other day, but if you come from a Jewish background of any kind, you see people who, in a different moment in time, were negotiating what it meant to be Jewish and then part of a secular society of some kind, France, London, whatever it was. And the thought processes and the anxieties and the conclusions are very much contemporary. I think there's that aspect of it. But then there's also something that I guess is and is not Jewish about it, but it just the family history in general as a narrative thread. I mean, there's something about that that's very captivating as well.
Compelling,
Yeah, compelling,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And I don't really know quite what to make of that, but there's definitely something there, I would think.
Tom, do you have a thought about that?
Not other than to say, I think it's an interesting moment where we're rethinking what the national heritage is, and that's partly to do with living in multicultural societies and thinking about the contribution of different minorities. And I think some of the kind of what we thought was tradition looks different if we ask different questions of it, and we look harder at the people who made the tradition or who made the establishment. And so I think the kind of Jewish lens gives you a kind of oblique lens onto Britishness, just as thinking about other minority groups and other kind of post-colonial questions and so on does the same thing as well. So.
And the Jewish Country Houses project, obviously, I mean, there have been lots of books about country houses.
Yes.
This is a completely different slant, a different take that opens up new stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
New definitions.
Well, Jean, thank you so much for being here tonight. And we do have time for a few questions. So, yes, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. That was very, very interesting. My family is Jewish, completely not Orthodox or practicing any longer, but I was brought up in a way that, makes a lot of what you were talking about very recognizable to me. But the one thing that I always understood that you didn't mention and I might be completely wrong about this, you were talking about the motivation for the Wertheimers and others to donate their works of art to public institutions rather than keeping them. And I think there are two aspects to that. First of all, my understanding is that part of the reason for that was that they wanted to become acceptable, and there was, you know, this was one way that they could not exactly buy their way into society,
Sort of.
but it was a way of showing that you know, their benevolence could kind of almost outdo the traditions of the British aristocracy, who were very, very stuck in their ways and very much wanted to preserve their own country estate. So I don't know, I might be completely wrong about that, but that was something that I always, I mean, I studied history and things.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, that's definitely right.
Because there was a lot of anti-Semitism all the way through this period, and that's another thing as well, that you were talking about the sons of the Wertheimers who and their education, and UCS starting, you know, but there were certainly when I was growing up, and I'm sure even more before that, there were quotas in institutions all over, certainly in London. You couldn't belong to a golf club or go to certain private schools if they had some Jews there already, and there was a quota, and then that was it, basically. So just a couple of observations, but thank you, it was very interesting.
Thank you very much. Yes?
You talked a lot about collecting and taste, and you talked about the French taste and also the American taste at the sort of turn of the century, the Fricks, being not dissimilar to the taste of the nouveau Jewish immigrants like Wertheimers. But I was wondering whether, I know that Waddesdon, for example, through the Rothschilds, through these lavish dinner parties, invited all the aristocracy to come and see their amazing home and their amazing interiors. And I think that people thought it was over the top and over sort of lavish. And I think, was there sort of an inverted snobbery with the old money not trying as hard as the new money, because they had these houses and they had these amazing art collections that had been in their families for so many generations, that might have sort of had a sort of a little dust on it and not so sort of pristine and sparkly. Do you think that there was this inverted snobbery about the lavish new money and the Jewish taste being a bit gaudy?
Yeah, absolutely. And the older families didn't have to try. They didn't need to prove anything. I mean, those paintings had been on their walls for 300 years. Alfred de Rothschild had a house at Halton, which is no longer a private house. He gave it to I believe to the Royal Navy. But there were incredibly snobby things that people said about the taste with which he had decorated his house. I don't know if I can find it right away, but I'll look and while we go on to another question. It was, but old money always sneers at new money. It was true in the U.S. where money wasn't that old, but there was, I think I told the story that when Harvard was looking to build a new library, someone suggested that they ask Andrew Carnegie, who was giving millions of dollars to build libraries. And one of the trustees of Harvard said, well, we wouldn't want to have Andrew Carnegie's name associated with Harvard for all time. So they waited until a Widener went down on the Titanic.
And of course, that's the same story about the founding of Stanford, right? The apocryphal, right? The refusal to take the money. And I think Jean was mentioning in her remarks earlier the Goncourt brothers and the sneering at collectors like Edmund de Rothschild and others in Paris. And this is exactly the critique. It's that it's sort of too much and too shiny, too flashy. All the same things that the Goncourt brothers would have celebrated in other homes, but because of the extent of the display and the extent of the lavishness, it's somehow inappropriate because it's too much. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, well, and I mean the number of paintings in the Wertheimer bequest underline the easily made criticism that Jews go in for excess. So same with all that gaudy
Right.
decor.
I saw a hand somewhere, yes.
I was wondering about your reflections on, given that a lot of these portraits are filled with a lot of joy compared to portraits of non-Jewish people that are very kind of fixed. Do you think it's a reflection on their experiences throughout life? I mean, they didn't have to adhere to a lot of these structural, rigid processes and things that a lot of these older families and old money had to. We hear about Consuelo Vanderbilt, for example, and having to marry into his family and adhere to their protocols. Do you think that that's a reflection of their experience of daily life, or do you think that that's more about the relationship between the sitter and the artist?
Yeah, and on that point as well, there's a lot of humour that comes in your book about how there seems to be a lot of humour precisely on that point, and also talking
Humor,
about,
did you say?
yeah, humour. I think there's a lot of humour in the portraits, calling your dog noble, or
Yes.
all your clients are the nobles. You know, there's a lot of humour going in there, and
Yeah.
also referring to the Dreyfus affair, it's interesting that it's lesbian, Jews, and a gay painter. And, you know, having lived in a teenager in France, we never were taught any counter action that in support of Dreyfus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really fascinating to hear that it's done with humour
Yeah.
and with a sense of insouciance, if you want,
Yes.
and of a good fight, we should call it in Old English, I suppose. And that's interesting in the book as well, that there seems to be, like you're saying, it seems the good fight is to basically take the piss, I think. And I think it comes, I mean, that's probably a bit vulgar, but it comes across like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you agree with this, and with your French and the research you did, if there was any of other like humorous, there seems to be a humorous response to these quite serious matters.
Yes, and I mean, sorry, did you want to say something?
Go ahead.
In the point about Orientals, there's lots of Oriental imagery in this. I think Sargent was playing with that as well, as you said, in terms of humor, in terms of his freedom. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this one, but the youngest daughter, Almina, he dressed her up as an Oriental, well, it's based on an Anglo picture, but so she's supposedly a slave in a Turkish costume playing an Indian sarod in a harem. So a Jew, an Oriental Jew, dressing up as an Oriental slave, and also referring to 18th century portraits which were full of Oriental Turkish costumes and poses and so on. So his client is a very experienced art dealer who knew they're making jokes in a way with each other. It's a very sophisticated interaction. And I think they're having fun, which is part of what I think you see in Asher's eyes, that it's more amused and twinkling than counting golden shekels.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question that you raise. I wonder if it's, I mean, again, like Jean is the expert on Sargent and the Wertheimers, but in general, I think that it might be more of an expression of a particular relationship between subject and painter, because, you know, first of all, I don't think it's, I mean, certainly, yes, like Jews are not aristocrats in this kind of classically minted English way or in the kind of French way at the time either, but, you know, Jewish families, especially the sort of elite ones, have codes and strictures of their own that are quite repressive and patriarchal family systems that, at least in, you know, some of the families that I looked at, I mean, drove the women in the family crazy and in some ways away from Judaism altogether. So I don't know that it was necessarily like a freer existence that manifests itself in different portraits, like necessarily because of the Jewishness outside of Sargent. But I mean, I think you're definitely right that there's something with these paintings that there's more levity and more freedom to them.
Yeah, although we shouldn't, I mean, several of his other paintings are full of life. It's
Yes,
not
of
only
course.
his Jews that look this
Right.
great. He's, anyway, I won't name them, but it wasn't only this, but this was a very powerful
Yeah.
connection.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, in the back.
You've implied, I think you've implied a legacy for now, but I was wondering whether you had anything to sort of add, sort of moving forward with this, with the concepts.
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you.
Legacy.
A legacy,
Legacy today. of this? Is it all consigned to history, or is it something that can be carried forward? And is it being carried
What do you mean it? What the portraits, the relationship,
Yeah,
the foregrounding of Jews?
Mainly the portraits, but also the art dealers. How is this being carried forward, or is it just a snapshot of history, something embedded in?
You mean the sort of like the world of the Jewish dealers and collectors and sitters and
Well, yes. I mean, I just I can make historical notes, but I just wondered about moving forwards.
sort of what does it mean for today, and when we think about it, is it sort of frozen in amber, or is it?
I don't think so. I think it's, this all continues. We haven't talked about the Sharkey dealers who were using their expertise to fleece their clients, but that still goes on too. Not Asher, actually. But I think art still is a way of purchasing status and stature. I don't really know how to answer that. Do you?
Yeah, well, I think I would think of it in a slightly different way, which is that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to see through lines from any historical moment to another in a sort of definitive way, I think. But one thing that I think remains very true is that art, broadly conceived, remains a crucial laboratory for identity formation, self-presentation, and the negotiation of, like Tom was saying, the minority experience, however defined. And so, the questions posed might be different today, and certainly are different today than they were in London of 1907 or Paris in the throes of the Dreyfus Affair, but in general, I mean, that's still very true, I think. And the art may look very different, but I think the questioning and the process is still there. All right, and I think that brings us to an end. So let's have a round of applause for Jean.
Thank you both. All it remains for me to say is thanks to both James and Jean for a wonderfully wide-ranging and stimulating conversation that was also, I think, a snapshot of a sort of whole moment in Edwardian London. And that question about legacy at the end, I think it's very interesting that if the Wertheimers had not been painted by Sargent, would we be talking about them at all? This art was immortality, whereas Charles Wertheimer, who went for Millet rather than Sargent, we do not reflect on in the same way. And I think it's interesting how the artist has actually created the memory around the business and the firm in a very special way. So next Thursday, just if you're thinking about lectures and you're interested in the Edwardian period, next Thursday on May 22nd, there will be a lecture here by Samuel Raybone, who is going to be talking about the Davies sisters, who were sort of pioneering Welsh sisters before the First World War, who collected French Impressionism. And lots of the wonderful Impressionist paintings in Cardiff come from that bequest, so it's a fantastic story. But please do join us for a glass of wine next door. Please continue the conversation. There'll also be a chance to purchase one of Jean's wonderful books. Maybe she'll sign it if you ask her very nicely. But can I end by saying thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see you on a sunny evening, and please join me again in thanking James and Jean.